One of my favorite researchers is Dyer. What a great talk show host, and I'm always blessed to have him Fridays do the fourth hour. And you have the ADL branding everything as if you don't support censorship and global government, the Ukraine war, you're anti-Semitic, Elon Musk is anti-Semitic, Donald Trump's anti-Semitic. It's preposterous. But what's the larger, from a guy that has written a bunch of best-selling books and has a massive library and it really mainly quotes the globalist, who's really in charge of the Jay, and what's going on with Judy? Because we know Israel 70% are against Netanyahu, but still he's in charge, or 70% are against Trudeau, but he's still in charge, parliamentary system. So I don't want to see as one block because the majority of them don't even like what Netanyahu's doing. I'm not even attacking Netanyahu. I'm just saying the bigger picture, deep distillation. I'm going to let you talk and just turn it over to you. You can change subject whenever you want. I won't be here anymore. I'm going to be listening. But obviously they're trying to put in front of the new order. They're trying to make it front and center. What do you make of that from your deep research? What do the globalist texts say, and what really runs the floor?
Yeah, I think that amongst, like you said earlier in the show, the power blocks that exist, there's multiple factions vying for power. And I think most of the big geopolitical texts speak of it that way. Different factions, different groups, different mafias would like to have the upper hand. That requires working together amongst a lot of different mafias. You know, look at the way the Sicilian mafia and the other mafias all work together in the 20th century. And that's a kind of a model for the big macro picture of how I understand the geopolitics of the New World working. And so I think when you said earlier in the show, the real issue is not different people groups, because evil isn't restricted to any biological or genetic determinism. Evil is, in my view, a moral action. It's not something that people have in their DNA or in their group. Any specific group can act evil. Any individual person can act evil, and evil is an action. It's not a collective entity. Evil is also something, like I said, that we do morally, and it pertains to spiritual realities, in my view. So I think the head of the New World Order ultimately is Lucifer, is Satan. And then underneath that power structure, you have these competing mafias that would like to have the upper hand. And if you look at, the modern nation state of Israel post Balfour and Sykes-Picot, this was really something that the British government helped to set up. And I think they did that as a way to have a beachhead, to have an Anglo-American establishment nation state as a proxy that they could set up in the Middle East to run operations. And that's why we see that eventually the nation of Israel that's reestablished then gets tired of the British having, been their rulers there, and then there's bombings and so forth that moves them towards
exactly just like Hitler and Stalin turned on his constant double crossing.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's a way oversimplification to try to make everything about one of the mafias or one of the groups. There's always this coordination, and certainly there are very powerful groups in all of these areas. And when I read a lot of the texts of these people, like Brzezinski or David Rockefeller, they interpret and understand these kinds of distinctions amongst people groups or religions as pieces on the chessboard, as tools, right? So they're able to utilize these distinctions, and they can push these differences as techniques of divide and conquer, as techniques of dialectics, as you said earlier. How can we foster disagreements in the Middle East? Well, there's an ancient rivalry between Islam and Judaism, for example. If you look at in my research, I've gone really deep into the history of Islam in the last 4 years. Prior to that, I knew a little bit about Islam, but not a lot of it. I didn't know about a lot of the textual history and a lot of what was actually in the Quran. And so I've gotten a lot deeper into that. And a lot of those texts bear a really fanatical hatred between Judaism and Islam. And so that divide there can be pushed, that can be utilized on a bigger scale, and it might be utilized in, for example, Europe. I think there's a larger plan to Islamicize Europe, and you can read about that. The global elite talked about that 100 years ago. People like Bertrand Russell, people in the Royal Society said they would use, the Fabians said they would use Islam as a way to completely change the makeup, the look of Europe. Now, they're not doing that because they believe Islam. They just saw it as a way to change the existing Christian structure that was there, that they saw as a stumbling block. So when I look at people like, Tiny Mustache Man, and I read Dr. Carol Quigley as well as Anthony Sutton and multiple other texts, and if you read Brzezinski, he actually cites Anthony Sutton. So Brzezinski himself sees Sutton as a legitimate, valid source for this stuff. And Sutton and Sutton and Quigley talk about the Bank of England is who really sent money to. There's a whole section in Tragedy and Hope. It was I think Schroeder Bank. Alan Dulles had a role, I think, at Schroeder Bank. I think it's page 1059 or 1049 of Tragedy and Hope, discussing the fact that the Western elites, it's not just banking houses, it's also corporate industries that really helped to build up Hitler and his government. And they wanted Hitler to go into Poland. They wanted that war, the Western establishment as a whole. And so it wasn't just one person or one group wanting that war. It was very wealthy, very powerful elites wanting that war for multiple reasons, to make money off of ammunitions and debt for the future. When Germany lost, the future generations of the German people would then be forever into debt to the West. That's that whole World Bank, IMF model of perpetual generational debt enslavement. So that's not restricted to any single group of people. If you can go back to the Middle Ages, for example, didn't have a whole lot of power in the Middle Ages. They were in the minority pretty much everywhere they were. And it wasn't those in the Middle Ages, for example, that were able to push usury. A lot of people identify usury in the West with, and it's true that Judaism allows for usury, but that couldn't have happened in the West if the papacy had not, for example, changed its position on the promotion and allowance of usury, which happened in the Renaissance period. So there's a lot of examples of this, which I think make it more complex than it's all that group, it's all that group. I think all these groups work together at certain levels and at certain times for different ends. And I think that right now we're seeing a lot of powerful groups vying for control of the global power structure and all that. But I don't think that in the end, if you were in China, for example, it's true that, China has made deals with people in the Clinton administration back in the 90s. They made deals with the Israelis at different points. But I don't think that from the Chinese perspective, for example, they envision a future that is, I think they envision a future that's Chinese. Haven't they put out a document, explaining their long-term 100,000-year geopolitical plan for the dominance of China? So I think you're right to bring up that different power blocks have different motivations and different end games. And there can be, competing levels of power and influence in different ways. Now, certainly in the West, we see a lot of influence from, AIPAC and these kinds of things. But there's also a tremendous amount of influence from Islam, Saudi Arabia, Islamic banking, for example. People don't talk about Islamic banking. Banking is thought to be, just a Jewish thing, but actually there's a large, very powerful international Islamic banking structure. And that ties into the history of the funding, for example, of radical terror groups, the Muslim Brotherhood. Robert Dreyfus has a really good book on this called Devil's Game, for example. Mark Curtis has a really good book called Secret Affairs, which he's a Royal Society researcher. And I've done lectures through these books on my YouTube channel years ago. And these books really illustrate the way that the Western establishment has attempted to utilize radical Islam, not just going back to the divvying up of the Middle East through people like Lawrence of Arabia, but that same model is then adopted by the CIA post 1950s and 60s, when they discarded pan-Arabism and then adopted the model of the British Empire of using radical Islam. So the British Empire had a strategy that they wanted to capture and control Mecca. That was one of the British imperial strategies there that had to do with competing with Ottoman Empire at the time. So when you think about big global empires, that I think helps especially in the 20th century, and which ones declined and which ones came to power. That helps us understand, I think, the nuance of not falling into the trap of thinking that everything is run by a single entity or a single group, even though you can have these entities with a lot of power and a lot of influence. So I wanted to talk today about something that ties in very well to what Alex was talking about earlier when he was discussing the dialectical manipulation. And there's a great article that was written several years ago over at Washington's blog, and it's basically just sort of taking a journey through all of the admitted examples of false flags. And when we look at all of these, what we're going to see is that this is not restricted to any single tribe or group of people. It's not restricted to Islamic governments. It's not restricted to the West. It's not restricted to Tiny Mustache Man. This is a technique, a tactic that's been used by governments and power structures, and conceivably even non-governmental actors, private groups, NGOs, think tanks, corporations. They might also be engaged in false flag operations. So today I want to talk about the 42 admitted examples of false flags, and we'll kind of work through these really quick, and you'll see that once we understand that this is a technique, we're going to be a lot more perceptive in decoding the supposed events that come out all the time that we're supposed to just accept at face value. And when we understand that there's a long history of false flags, we're not going insane, or we're not being tinfoil hat people when we consider the possibility of false flags. Anybody that reads and studies warfare, for example, military people, military historians, people that study psychological warfare, they would all know, everybody knows, that you can stage an event, or it can be real, it can be fake, it can be, however you want to set it up, whatever works for the specific situation. And it's done to blame the enemy, right? To give you the perception of being a victim, to give you the perception of the right to, do this or that in some international conflict or theater of war. One of the first examples that's listed, and by the way, they're all cited at the Washington blog website in terms of everything is linked here to various government websites and commissions and official reports. Japanese troops, for example, in 1931 blew up a small train and blamed it on China in order to justify the invasion of Manchuria. This is known as the Mukden incident, or the Manchurian incident. And the Tokyo International Military Tribunal found that several participants in this plan, including Hashimoto, the high-ranking Japanese army officer, on various occasions admitted that they did take part in this plot, and that the purpose of this incident was to give an excuse for the occupation of Manchuria by the Kwantung army. So that's one example. And if we think about this, well, does this mean that, I guess China's all the good guys and the Japanese are all the bad guys? No, this is just one example of a historical conflict, and it doesn't make either side inherently good or bad from the vantage point of this action, right? Number two, SS officials in the Nazi regime admitted at Nuremberg trials that under the orders of the Gestapo, they had faked attacks on their own people and resources and blamed it on the Poles, and that this was used as the justification by Hitler for the invasion of Poland. Now, remember, in Quigley, that was all, there was a dual policy where the British establishment and the Western corporations and Bank of England and others put money into helping Tiny Mustache Man come to power and to have the armaments and the war machine that he had. That's admitted. Quigley's not a conspiracy man. He's a establishment CFR historian and archivist. So that we're basically getting the admission that this was done for the purpose of giving a justification for the invasion of Poland. I'm talking about this false flag event. Another false flag event involving the SS was, the German leader Franz Halder testified that together with Hermann Goering, they had set fire to the German parliament building in 1933, and they blamed it on a slow boy who claimed to be a communist who was the patsy. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev admitted that the Soviet Red Army shelled the Russian village of Manila in 1939 and blamed it on Finland. This gave a basis, then, a justification for launching the Winter War against Finland. This was later admitted to and discussed by Boris Yeltsin. Of course, Yeltsin himself was a Western CIA asset to help loot Russia after the fall of the wall. Number 5, the Russian parliament admitted that Putin and former Soviet leader Gorbachev, that Stalin had been involved in a secret police order to execute 22,000 Polish officers in 1940, and this was blamed on the Nazis. So you see that this is a technique and a tactic that's used all the time. It doesn't make the other side that's the victim necessarily the good guys. It means they're innocent in this event, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily angel cakes or good people, right? The British government admitted that between 1946 and 1948, that it had bombed 5 ships carrying, attempting to flee persecution in Germany and seek refuge in Palestine. They set up a fake group called the Defenders of Arab Palestine, and then had this pseudo group claim responsibility for this event. In 1954, Israel admits that an Israeli cell operating in Egypt bombed several buildings, including the U.S. diplomatic facility. And this evidence was left behind then to implicate Arabs as the culprits. This stokes, again, Middle Eastern conflict. The CIA admitted that it hired Iranians in the 1950s to pose as communists and stage bombings in Iran in order to turn the country against the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and this helps to bring in the Shah, who was a CIA man, all declassified, right? Operation Ajax. The Turkish Turkish Prime Minister admitted that the Turkish government carried out the 1955 bombing of a Turkish consulate in Greece, which damaged the nearby birthplace of the founder of modern Turkey, and it was blamed on Greece for the purpose of inciting and justifying anti-Greek versus Turk violence. Number 10, the British Prime Minister admitted to his Defense Secretary and American President Dwight Eisenhower that they approved of a plan in 1957 to carry out attacks on Syria and blamed it on the Syrian government as a way to effect a regime change. Very similar, by the way, to what we saw in the 2010s with the chemical weapons attack supposedly blamed on Assad. They used the white helmets, was a front organization that was all fake. The chemical attack was then later proven and shown to be staged by the BBC. Or the BBC was involved in that staging. Former Italian minister and judge, former head of Italian counterintelligence, admitted that NATO, with the help of the Pentagon and the CIA, this is, of course, Operation Gladio, headed up by Kissinger, carried out terror bombings in Italy via Gladio and other European countries in the 1950s that was blamed on left and communist groups in order to rally support for the governments in Europe in the fight against communism. Now, does that mean that I think communism and Marxism is good? Of course not. I think they're horrible atheistic systems. But I'm willing to admit that that doesn't make it good and right to engage in Gladio-style terror operations in France, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, UK, where black op hit teams engage in these kinds of operations. One participant in the Gladio operation said, "You had to attack civilians, people, women, children, innocents, in order to be an unknown people far removed from the politics. The reasoning was quite simple. This would then force the Italian public to turn to the state for greater security and against any notions of, quote, liberalism." In 1960, American Senator George Smothers suggested that the U.S. launch a false flag on Guantanamo Bay, which then give an excuse to hype up tensions and go to war with Castro. 13, the State Department showed that in 1961, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other officials discussed blowing up a consulate in the Dominican Republic to justify an invasion of the Dominican Republic. Plans were not carried out. However, they were discussed as serious proposals. Number 14, the U.S. government recently declassified documents in 1962 that show that the American Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on a plan to blow up American airplanes and to commit terror acts on American soil, and then again blame it on Cuba and to justify an invasion of Cuba. That doesn't mean that I think Cuban communism or Castro is a good guy. I think he's a total globalist. This is just demonstrating that false flags are not foreign to the historical military record. They're actually pretty normal when it comes to how the state or how governance actually occurs. In the following ABC report, official documents show that the former Washington investigative reporter for ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings discusses that American Airlines report. That was part of number 14. Number 15, in 1963, the U.S. Defense Department wrote a paper promoting attacks on nations within the Organization of American States, such as Trinidad, Tobago, or Jamaica, that would then also be falsely blamed on Cuba. So quite a few of these at that time period related to Cuba. Number 16, the Defense Department suggested covertly planting a person or paying a person in the Cuban Castro government to attack the United States. This would then give a justification again for some sort of operation against Cuba. Number 17, the NSA admits that it lied about what really happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. In 1964, there was a manipulation of data to make it look like the North Vietnamese had fired on the U.S. ship. This created a justification for the Vietnam War, and it was actually Jim Morrison of the Doors, his dad, Admiral Morrison, that was on the ship involved in that event. Number 18, U.S. Congressional Committee admitted that as part of its COINTEL program, the FBI used many provocateurs in the 1950s throughout the 1970s that carried out violent actions and falsely blamed it on political activists. Now, you might say, well, but those were radical leftists, and so maybe the system had to do that to shut down the crazy leftists. We understand that the system nowadays does the exact same thing to all of the right-wing groups that are out there. Number 19, a top Turkish general admitted that the Turkish forces burned down a mosque in Cyprus in 1970 and then blamed it on the Cypriot. The general explained, in this special war, acts of sabotage are staged and blamed on the enemies to increase public resistance. We did this against Cyprus. We even burned down a mosque. In response to the surprised correspondent's incredulous look, the general said, I'm just giving you one example. German government admitted in 1978 that the German Secret Service detonated a bomb in the outer wall of a prison and planted the escape tools on the prisoner involved in the Baader-Meinhof Red Army faction, which the Secret Service then wished to blame the bombing on. Number 21, a Mossad agent admits, this is, I think, Viktor Ostrovsky's book, By Way of Deception. In 1984, Mossad planted a radio transmitter on Gaddafi in his compound in Tripoli, Libya, which broadcast fake terrorist transmissions recorded by Mossad in order to frame Gaddafi as a terror supporter. As a result, Reagan then bombed Libya afterwards. Number 22, South African Truth and Reconciliation Council found that in 1989, the Civil Cooperation Bureau, a covert branch of the South African Defense Force, approached an explosives expert and asked him to participate in an operation aimed at discrediting the ANC, African National Congress, thus framing the ANC. That doesn't mean, by the way, that I think the ANC is good. I think they're terrible, but the point is that this is just another example of operations. So we're through about half of the list. And when we come back from this break, we'll go through the other half of this list of 40 plus admitted on the show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Welcome back to the show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis, and we are working through the classic article that's over at Washington's blog that might have been forgotten. And since we're kind of in the week still, I guess you could say, of the remembrance of the Big 9 event from 2001, we're only a few days after that, I thought it would be good to rehearse this principle of flag operations and how that ties into what I was talking about today with dialectical manipulation. And number 23 is where we got to. An Algerian diplomat and several officers in the Algerian army admitted that in the 1990s, the Algerian army frequently massacred Algerian civilians and blamed Islamic militants for the killing. And that's actually in the French press that it's cited there. So again, all of these are mainstream sourced. They're not sourced from conspiracy websites. And I would add too that doesn't make Islamic militants or Islamic philosophy good. Remember that, again, this is a technique that any state or power can use as an opposition force. And even those not in power can conceivably use it. It doesn't have to be the state. It can be, small cells of guerrilla operators who do not have state power. They could also conceivably engage in this. Number 24, an Indonesian fact-finding team investigated the violent riots from 1998, which determined that elements of the military had been involved in provoking the riots, and thus it was a stage provocateur event, not an organic riotous event. Number 25, senior Russian military and intelligence officers admitted that the KGB was involved in blowing up a Russian apartment building in the 1990s. And this was blamed on the Chechens as part of the justification of an invasion of Chechnya. Number 26, the Washington Post admitted in 2002 that an Indonesian police and military killed American teachers in Papua in 2002 and blamed it on the Papuan separatist group in order to get that group listed as a terrorist organization. So this was done to just list this group and sort of out to ban them and get them shut down. Number 27, the well-respected Indonesian president admitted that the government played a role in the Bali bombings. Number 28, the BBC and New York Times and AP reported that Macedonian officials admit that the government murdered 7 innocent immigrants and pretended that these were Al-Qaeda cells to promote the war on terror in Macedonia. Number 29, senior officials in Genoa, Italy admitted that in 2001 at the G8 summit, the police, I believe, were involved in planting Molotov cocktails and the stage stabbing of a police officer to justify the violent crackdown of the G8 protesters. Number 30, the FBI admits that in 2001, the anthrax attacks carried out by one or more government scientists were actually U.S. government scientists. They were not Al-Qaeda operatives. 23, government officials also confirmed that the White House tried to link anthrax to Iraq, which was a false linking, and that was part of the justification for the Iraq war. Number 31, the U.S. blamed Iraq for playing a role in 9/11. This was shown by a memo from the Defense Secretary as one of the main justifications for the Iraq war. However, after Cheney and others had claimed this, there was no evidence or proof that Iraq had any involvement whatsoever in the 9/11 events. Number 32, former Justice Department lawyer John Yoo suggested in 2005 that the U.S. should go on the offensive against Al-Qaeda and use intelligence agencies to create fake terror cells and organizations that would have their own websites, their own recruitment centers, their own training camps, their own fundraising operations, which is kind of what ISIS and all of that is. So kind of spilling the beans there. Number 33, UPI, United Press International, in 2005, admitted, quote, U.S. intelligence officers reporting that some of the insurgents in Iraq are using Beretta 92 pistols. The serial numbers, however, have been erased. The numbers do not appear to have been physically removed. The pistols are actually seem to have come off of the line in production without any serial numbers. This suggests, according to some analysts, that the weapons were intended for intelligence operations or terrorist cells with substantial government backing. Analysts then speculated that these guns were probably delivered from either Mossad or the CIA. Analysts speculate that the agent provocateurs may have been using untraceable weapons, even as U.S. authorities use insurgent attacks against civilians as evidence of illegitimacy of the resistance. Number 34, undercover Israeli soldiers admitted in 2005 to throwing stones at other Israeli soldiers to blame on Palestinians, which was used as an excuse to crack down on peaceful protests of the Palestinians. Number 35, the Quebec police admitted in 2007 that thugs carrying rocks to a peaceful protest were actually undercover Quebec police officers. 36, at the G20 protests in London in 2009, British member of Parliament admitted to seeing plainclothes officers attempting to incite the crowd to violence. Number 37, Egyptian politicians admitted that the government employees looted priceless museum artifacts in 2011 to discredit protesters. Number 38, Colombian army colonel admitted that his unit murdered 57 civilians and then dressed them in uniforms and claimed there were rebels killed in combat. Number 30, by the way, Operation Mincemeat or the sinking of the Lusitania, these are other examples that are not on this list. Mincemeat, of course, is well known, and there's a whole movie about Operation Mincemeat, which came out fairly recently. That was involving Ian Fleming and others in setting up a staged dead body to mislead the German military. The highly respected writer for The Telegraph, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, this number 39, says that the head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Bandar, admitted that the Saudi government controls Chechen terror networks. Number 40, high-level American sources admitted that the Turkish government, which is a fellow NATO country, carried out chemical weapons attacks and blamed the Syrian government. High-ranking Turkish government admitted on tape plans to carry out these attacks and then blame it on Syria. Exactly. That's what I mentioned earlier. Number 41, the former Ukrainian security chiefs admitted that the sniper attacks which started the Ukrainian coup were actually carried out in order to frame others. So this relates directly to the war in the Ukraine. Back in 2014, the snipers which riled up the crowd, the Maidan coup, and all that. That was actually engineered by the West. Britain's spy agency, British intelligence, has admitted, number 42, that it carries out digital false flags by attacks on targets, by framing people, by writing offensive or unlawful materials, and then blaming it on them via sock puppets. In addition, two-thirds of the city of Rome burned in 64 AD under Nero, and the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for this event, famous historical false. In fact, as the author of the Washington Blogs Post notes, some of the top Roman leaders, including the Roman consul Cassius, as well as historians like Suetonius, do agree that it's actually Nero that started the fire. This is based largely on the fact that the Roman Senate had just rejected Nero's application to clear 300 acres in Rome to build a giant palace. The fire then allowed him to build that palace. And so because this is such a common thing in warfare or in regional conflicts, it actually has its own tagged name. Now, it doesn't mean that everything in warfare or every event is fake or flag. That's certainly not true. These are just ones that are known and admitted in his list. There's actually others as well. Miles Copeland, in his book Game of Nations, the history of his operations with the CIA in Egypt, Syria and Egypt. There's a whole chapter, whole section where he talks about his usage of radicals who were terrorists. Says they're very useful to the CIA. But the point is that you have essentially this is so common that it's got a term, a false operation, right? And this list doesn't even include an event, the Big Nine, which we just were reminded of 4 or 5 days ago. I think if you look at the history of that event, there's all kinds of indicators, clues that show very similarly that it was one of those same types of events. If you look at the way that a controlled demolition occurs, if you look at the PNAC documents ahead of time, if you look at Operation Vigilant Guardian, which was running drills of the same operations, if you look at Alex's interviews with Barry Jennings, all of those things I think speak to more and more of this phenomenon. So it's not a conspiracy theory, it's an admitted common thing in history. This is the Jones Show, don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Jones Show. We were just covering 40 plus admitted by the establishment, various establishments, historical false flag events, and how those events are used as a tool of manipulation to garner sympathy for the state, to frame an opponent, to start a war, to get funding, to get a group named as a terrorist organization. It's a very common, well-known tactic, and I think that most people think, well, I wouldn't operate that way. And so it's certainly not possible. The government cares about me, the system, it cares about my life. They wouldn't lie about me. They wouldn't create a staged event or a real event and blame it on an enemy. That's just not very nice. The power structure operates on a pragmatic basis. They operate on a pragmatic power basis. And when we read the writings of the elite, that's exactly what we find. We find that level of Machiavellianism, that level of manipulation, that level of psychopathy. There's a phrase that comes up in psychology called the dark triad. And the dark triad traits in psychology are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes people have one or two of them, and maybe perhaps all three of them, but it doesn't really matter because it's a great way to describe the modus operandi of the establishment. And in today's discussion, there was a lot of concern about certain groups, but I want to give an example of somebody that many Israelis, for example, don't like. They don't like people like Zbigniew Brzezinski. And if you go and read a book like Between Two Ages, this is the book that when Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller saw this text written by this young academic at the time in the 1970s, they said, here's a guy that we need to put in charge of some kind of group. And so in the early 70s, they put him in charge. I think 1973, they put Zbigniew Brzezinski in charge of the Trilateral Commission, which is one of these higher level steering committees peopled by a lot of people from the Council on Foreign Relations, which already existed since the 1920s. This is another higher level type of committee. Guess what? They did the same thing with another person you might have heard of called Klaus Schwab. And so the Harvard project, headed up by Kissinger, said, take that Schwab guy, put him in charge of something. And so Klaus went from Bilderberg to the project they set up called Davos, or the World Economic Forum. So in other words, these individuals here running these kinds of situations, setting these kinds of things up, this is at the level of Kissinger and at the level of Brzezinski. Has a lot of CIA involvement, but this is, I think you could say, this is a level above normal intelligence operations. This is at the level of, the real movers and shakers in the power elite. And if we move through a little bit of Between Two Ages, this is going on almost, I think, 2.5, 3 years of hosting the fourth hour. I don't even recall if I've done a fourth hour on Brzezinski's Between Two Ages, but it works perfect, I guess, in the last few minutes of the fourth hour here to get into the basics of this book. And you'll see why Brzezinski was such a prodigy, I guess you could say, for the power structure, for the system to be recruited. Of course, Brzezinski's background comes from a family of Polish nobility, and thus there was a kind of long time hatred and animus and enmity between his family and the Russians, and so he was a perfect figure. In the Cold War, Brzezinski was at McGill University, which happens to be one of the key MK Ultra universities, by the way. And so Brzezinski wrote this book about the technocratic revolution, or what Klaus later calls in his books the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So understand that it's the same thing. They're referring to the same thing. Klaus's book was 2018. Zbigniew Brzezinski's book is 1970. And so he says that we're going to have to take account of where technology is going, because we are entering into a new revolution, kind of like the Industrial Revolution. But this is something unlike anything else in history. It's not comparable even to the earlier revolutions. That will far exceed that in its impact on human civilization. And one of the first things he talks about, which kind of blew me away, was the way that he describes the malleability of human beings and what they will mutate into. I'm not kidding. So, we think about books like The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I read not too long ago and wrote an essay on, which if you get this edition of it and read it, I highly recommend. It's one of the H.G. Wells books I read many years ago. If you get this edition, I recommend it because it has an introduction by a person from the Salk Institute. And if you know about Jonas Salk, we've covered his books like Man Unfolding and Survival of the Wisest, about the history of inoculations and genetic experimentation that he favors in terms of Malthusianism. Well, the article at the beginning, the introduction, is written by a person from the Salk Institute, and they write about how H.G. Wells was so ahead of his time when it came to human experimentation, for example. And the author of this book, who's a person from the establishment, talks about government experiments using Guatemalans in 1946 to 1948 for human experimentation. The introductory editor talks about human beings can be rewired and retooled, not just from the inside, but also via their environment, and that this could give rise to transhumanism, and that ultimately this would be a challenge for future man to remain man. And so the establishment, as we know, wants to move us past what it is to be human. Brzezinski talked about that in Mutating Man in the very first chapter of Between Two Ages. I'll read what he says. He says that life seems to lack cohesion in terms of modernity. With all of these rapidly evolving events and phenomena, man is becoming more and more manipulable and malleable. That's the plasticity of humankind that's talked about in The Island of Dr. Moreau. By the way, The Island of Dr. Moreau is an allegory for the world from the mad scientist perspective, right? The mad scientist wants to do this kind of genetic experimentation on the human race, and so the island is a microcosm, a mini example of what the scientism-based worldview has for the human world as a whole. Brzezinski goes on to say that everything seems more transitory and everything is temporal. External reality is moving to be more and more fluid. It's not solid. There's not stasis, pure flux, Heraclitus. The human being is more synthetic than authentic. Our senses perceive an entirely novel reality, one of our own making, but nevertheless, it is our own sensations, and they're quite real. More importantly, there is already already widespread concern about the possibility of biological and chemical tampering with mankind. That is now, up until now, been considered the immutable essence. In other words, men were perceived to have a human nature that makes them man. And if GMO man, if Frankenstein man is the future, then that means that there is no human nature or essence. Man can evolve into anything. Human conduct, some argue, can be predetermined and subject then to deliberate control. Man is increasingly acquiring the capacity to determine, for example, the sexuality of his children and affect that through drugs to the extent of their intelligence and modify and control their personalities. This is MK Ultra style stuff that he's referencing. Speaking of a future at most only a few decades away, an experimenter in intelligence control asserted, I should say, quote, I foresee the time when we shall have the means and therefore the inevitability to and temptation to manipulate the behavior and intellectual functionings of all people through environmental and biochemical manipulations of the brain. That's MK Ultra on a mass scale. And that is from a publication that Brzezinski is citing called Computer Technology from 1968. And the use of holography could be used to create the sensations of living presences or alternate realities, as well as creating the actuality of conversations by beaming lasers into the brain from a satellite. So he's talking about the possibility of Skynet mind control in the future. That's actually what it says. That's not me. That's Brzezinski citing that right there. You can read it for yourself. Not making it up. This is not just some random guy. This is, right, he was a national security advisor to many presidents, Obama, for example. He then goes on to talk about other things like weather weapons. And he says that the future, we envision in the future a situation where even the weather can be modified and become a type of a weapon. And now remember, that doesn't exist. It's your conspiracy theory if you talk about that, even though it's in Brzezinski's book on page 57. But also, by the way, it does exist, and we have to do it to put it into climate change and the sun cooking us all, you see. So there's a lot more in that text. That's just a little introduction there to, again, how the establishment views humankind and what the possibilities are for human manipulation. And what better example of human manipulation than false operations? But it goes much further than that, because as Klaus and Brzezinski say, it'll be manipulation of the human genome itself. Head on over to my website if you want to support my work at jaysanalysis.com. You can buy my books in the shop.